Greetings, Kansas Farm Bureau members. I'm Kent Askren, Public Policy Director for Kansas Farm Bureau. Thank you for being here today to participate in these regional water planning meetings that are ongoing across our state. I apologize for not being able to be with you in person today, but I hope you'll find this presentation helpful as you prepare to review and deliberate Kansas Farm Bureau policy and make any recommendations that you have for our Board of Directors and our Resolutions Committee as we begin yet another season of public policy debate. So why are we here today? Well, Kansas Farm Bureau has significant water policy, as you can see from our policy book. So it's critical that we review what we have, that we fully understand it and its implications, and then take some time to discuss those policies and any potential changes or reiterations of that policy that you would like to make today. Unfortunately, we all take water for granted. I recently returned from a vacation to Colorado and Utah, and it is clear that where there is water, there is life, and there's abundant life. And where there's not water, it's not a very good place to be. We need to try and have a forward-thinking policy that keeps that from happening in Kansas. We have the opportunity yet today to make that happen. But there are challenges on the horizon that definitely need to be considered as we look at our policy. The legislature is becoming more and more aware of issues in our state dealing with water. And in all frankness, the legislature is not as understanding or maybe even as friendly to agriculture as it once was. There's definitely an evolving political climate out there. So we have to be aware of that and understand how we can be most effective in keeping our farming operations in business and keeping them as profitable as possible, while at the same time being responsible in the management of their natural resources. Kansas Farm Bureau needs to have policy that is far thinking down the road. Just dealing with today's issues is not going to set a very good working environment for future generations. So we need to have policy that not only is effective today, but is here for the long haul. And honestly, can we talk about water as though it's going to go extinct? Or should we talk about water in a way that it will be an enduring resource that must last forever? I really challenge you to think about that as you have your deliberations. A little bit of background, because these are statewide meetings. As we all know, or are aware, I believe, groundwater and surface water are our two primary types of water that are utilized across the state of Kansas. Groundwater is the predominant use in the West. The Ogallala Aquifer covers the western third, roughly, of our state. As you can see from the map on the left, the larger the circle, the more use. The blue color represents groundwater use. The more reddish or rust-colored represents surface water use. Surface water is more predominant in the east. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with the amount of rainfall that occurs in the east as opposed to the west. Not surprising to anyone. The map on the right gives even a little clearer picture of the active points of diversion from east to west. We have, in some counties, almost exclusively only surface water being used in the east. And in the west, we have counties that are almost exclusively groundwater with very little surface water use. So not anything too surprising here, but it just shows the diversity of our state. Groundwater, surface water, areas of over 40 inches of rain in the east, sometimes less than 15 inches in the west. Another major topic that has arisen over the past year that has heightened the water conversation deals with House Bill 2686, which was in the House Water Committee during the 2022 legislative session. That bill did not pass. It was gutted and amended, but there were several components of this enormous water bill that are worthy of conversation, and I think are topics that will be considered down the road. For the most part, Kansas Farm Bureau opposed the majority of the elements within House Bill 2686. One of those topics was agency consolidation. CNR 8 supports keeping natural resources agency authority separated. There was the topic of where the chief engineer within the Division of Water Resources should reside. Currently, the chief engineer resides and has for indefinitely been within the Department of Agriculture, formerly the State Board of Agriculture. Our policy AG 21 supports the chief engineer remaining within the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Another topic was groundwater management district board makeup. Now, I realize we don't have groundwater management districts, or GMDs as we refer to them, over much of the eastern half of the state. So that might be a term that some of you are new to. But these groundwater management districts are primarily composed of board of directors who are irrigation water right holders. There are some that have some municipal representation, stock watering, dairy, things like that. But the question came up in House Bill 2686 whether that should be a broader representation. We have some policy on that, and we can go into detail on what our policy says. It probably needs a little bit of attention anyway, but I would encourage you to become a little more educated on the GMDs, what they do, what the authority they operate under, and what our policy should say about that, specifically about GMD board makeup. Another topic that just seems to come up about every other year at least is taxing irrigation water use. Now, I'll spell out to you here in just a little bit some of the details of our water law. We don't own water. We own water rights, which are real property rights. And there are those who believe that since water is a common resource and some benefit from the use of that water by the exercising of their water rights, that there should be some payment for the use of that water. That's the argument that's out there. We have always opposed that because irrigated agriculture pays significantly in the form of increased property taxes, in the operation of irrigation pumps, and greater costs and inputs, much of which is taxed to go into the state water plan now. So we've argued against that and have been successful to this point. But I just want you to be aware of the conversations that are ongoing and the continual battle that I think will occur there. There's also the philosophy out there that if irrigation water were taxed, it would be an incentive to use less water. So those are the arguments that are being wrestled with. And I don't see this argument going away. I think there will continue to be a push by a more urban legislature moving forward to tax irrigation water use. So this is something that I would encourage you to have conversations about. And finally, one other topic that comes up almost regularly in the session is increasing water protection fees. Our policy opposes that, and we were successful in getting that pushed back again this session. But all of these issues, I'm confident, will come up again. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our water law. And I think it's important to have this basic understanding before you have any conversations about modifications of our policy, water policy, in the Kansas Farm Bureau policy book. As I mentioned earlier, the Kansas Water Appropriation Act has been around since 1945, over 75 years now. And the basic premise of the prior water appropriation right is the prior appropriations doctrine, as it's referred to, which most of the western states in the United States follows. First in time is first in right. So when there's not enough water for everybody's uses, there was a system established that those whose water rights were established first would be entitled to use the available water supply in the event of shortage relative to their priority. Now that does not, the law does not guarantee water to anybody. It can't manufacture water. It's just saying that of the available water, when there is a shortage, it's to go to the right that was established first. A key, very key component here is that it's the priority, not the type of use, that dictates who gets to use water. But it doesn't matter whether you're the majority user. It doesn't matter whether you're a higher, quote, higher value use. All that matters is the priority, fundamental in our water law. And I will say, there are starting to be some conversations, even at the legislative level, that maybe we should look at modifying that to make preferential use the leading determination as to who gets to use water in the event of shortage. Now, why is that not a good idea? Because we all know people should get water first, right? We all know livestock have to have water to drink, right? Well, somebody's going to make that call. And more than likely, it's not going to be somebody friendly to agriculture. And it's, in essence, what we're doing is we're taking from someone who was guaranteed under long-standing water law that if this shortage occurred, knowing that full well that eventually there will be shortages one way or the other, that instead of protecting that private property right with priority, we're now going to make it subjective, that somebody else steps in and says, well, we think this use or that use should be able to use that water instead of you, after maybe making a significant investment in that water right based upon the premise that it would be protected by its priority. So it's a very risky thing that we're talking about here that affects everyone across the state, whether you're in the wet east or the dry west, doesn't matter. Changing this or attempting to change this basic attribute of our water law is extremely risky. And I will say this, I have little doubt, I have no doubt that if we compromise on this and give this up, first of all, I don't have any idea. I don't believe the courts would uphold that, but who knows? Because I think it could be viewed as a taking. Anytime you've taken someone's private property right, which is what the water right is, and given it to someone else, I think it's going to at least be ripe for litigation. But the second thing is if in fact we did think that it's a good idea to use preferential use instead of the priority system in certain areas of the state, once that decision is made, the cat's out of the bag. That's never coming back. And it's going to sweep across the whole state. There will not be any rights that now are, quote, protected by priority. It would all go into the hands of someone making a subjective decision. Okay, enough on that, but let's move on. So as I mentioned earlier, water is a common public resource. We don't own water. And for those of us who are private property owners and water is on or under our property, that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow, but we must understand that, because with it being a common resource, water managers and legislators are going to always believe that they have a certain amount of responsibility to protect, quote, the public interest, since it belongs to the public. So we need to be mindful of this aspect of our water law. Modifying a water right is where the value in the water right comes in. So if someone does come in and say they have a more valuable use to that water, well, there's always the option for purchase of that water right. That's in the eyes of the beholder, and but it's there. Those are the protections that were built into our water law. There's not going to be anybody that goes thirsty. Um, there are going to be mechanisms to transmit water rights to the higher value use if and when those supplies become that short that we're now starting to um, see water right transactions occur to meet the higher value uses. So that will occur if we remain true to the system and don't put it into the hands of subjective decisions about where water is utilized. All water use within the state of Kansas requires a permit from the chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources before water use commences, with the lone exception being domestic use. This has been in the books since 1978. Now, that does not mean that domestic water rights are secondary in priority or in importance to any other type of use. There are 14 distinct beneficial uses of water recognized in our water law. Domestic is one of those. And I will say this, domestic has been overlooked, in my opinion, in all of the water planning and conversations that have gone on across our state. We must not run out of domestic water anywhere in the state of Kansas. If we take our eye off of domestic use, well, first of all, nearly every Kansas Farm Bureau member is a domestic water right holder. I have little doubt of that. And even though they have not been required to be made a matter of record, they have standing. And the domestic rights in our state, since they probably really have been handed down through the generations, are most likely the most senior water rights in the state. And that carries significance in terms of protection, again, through the priority system. So don't overlook domestic water rights. Think about the countryside for a moment. If there was not domestic water available, if after your long day at work, you come home and you cannot turn on the tap and take a shower, you cannot get a drink, you cannot prepare your meals, what do we have left? How can we sustain life? So domestic use must get a higher, become a higher part of this conversation, not only within Farm Bureau, but throughout the state. The Kansas Water Appropriation Act says nothing about it has to be fair. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that said when we get into, excuse me, these very challenging and difficult water conversations. So today, as you're having your conversations around your tables, and somebody says, well, it's got to be fair. Well, I'm sorry, but it really doesn't. There's nothing in the law about it being fair. Priority is the foundation and the protection of that private property right. That's the gist of it. And so, as we all know, being fair is in the eye of the beholder again, and it would be subjective. And politicizing water and politicizing our water law will take us down a terrible rabbit hole that we don't want to go down. And the West, California to the Rockies, is struggling with this right now. We must pay attention and learn, maybe from their mistakes even. We do not want to start making decisions upon what is some would be deemed as being fair. And so, last but not least, if you absolutely despise the prior appropriations doctrine, the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, My question is, what would you replace it with? Even if you were successful getting it through the courts, which I seriously doubt we would be, what would we replace it with? Yeah, we might end up like Texas or Oklahoma, or rule of capture, meaning that if it's on my land, it's mine to use however I want, whenever I want. That hasn't worked too well for them. They're in challenging situations down there. So many things to consider there. Okay, here's our primary water use policy, WA5. Supports the Water Appropriation Act, supports the protection, development, and administration, consistent with priority. It does support flexibility, but only so much that it would protect the water supply and existing water rights. It also states that when there is water shortage, it should be addressed with strict adherence to the water right priority system. And it also touches on voluntary incentive-based programs and stakeholder management plans. But those plans must be implemented in a way that they'll minimize the economic impacts and that they don't disadvantage senior water rights, priority again. And then last but not least, our policy does support intensive groundwater use control areas as an alternative. So that's the overview. Here's more on the policy, explicit policy of WA5 itself. And I won't read all of that for you, but it goes into detail. And you can come back to this slide if you need more time to read it, but I just wanted to make sure that it was pointed out to you and you had a chance to review that. Okay, as you contemplate and have your discussion, I just would reiterate that water rights are real property rights that are exclusively protected by priority and nothing else. Preferential use is specifically outlawed in our water law. And so any system that is choosing to use that today or tomorrow is currently not allowed in our water law. And I think it would benefit us greatly as a farm organization, as an agricultural industry, to keep that out of the conversation. One thing that also gets very little conversation, whether it be in the East or the West, what are our specific water supply goals? And once those goals are set, how do we achieve them? And I would go one step further to say, keep domestic water use in mind. If we don't have domestic water, the countryside changes dramatically in a negative way. And then if it's not priority, who or what determines who gets to use water when the supply is not adequate to meet everyone's needs? And lastly, should water use be taxed at the pump? I told you what some of the arguments are out there right now. We have policy that opposes that right now. If that's where we want to be, let's reaffirm that. If we want to have some discussion and think about that maybe differently, then let's have that discussion as well. All right. I didn't explain what domestic use is earlier, so I'll go into a little detail about that now. It's water that's used for household purposes, for the watering of lawns, gardens, and orchards to the extent of 2 acres or less. Water supplies that are used for domestic use generally include wells, springs, streams, things like that. And think about all of the livestock on pasture all across Kansas drinking out of these wells, streams, or springs. Those are all domestic water rights, unquantified for the most part and not made a matter of record, but they're valid and they're there just the same. Then everybody who has a well that they use to provide the water in their house, that's domestic as well. So these are very important rights. And I believe that they have gone completely unrecognized and noticed in our water policy, statewide water policy discussions. And we've got to bring that into the conversation. This slide you will not see probably anywhere else, but this comes from the Kansas Geologic Survey. It represents water well records. So these would be groundwater. Every green dot that you see on this map would represent a groundwater well or test hole that has gone in the state of Kansas. And this was valid up through March of 2021 when I requested this slide. This shows the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of wells that are out there, many of which are domestic. What this does not show, and would be just as impressive, and probably even more impressive, would be as if we had record and could show all of the surface water diversions. Think of all of the streams and the ponds across the state that are used for domestic use. If that was overlaid on this map, those would all be domestic water rights. They would overwhelm the system. But if we don't protect the resource with domestic in mind, we are doing a great disservice to agriculture and to the state as a whole. So I just wanted you to be aware of this map because you probably haven't seen that anywhere else. Okay, these can be determined or be viewed as desperate times, and sometimes that requires desperate measures. I don't think we're there yet, so we need to plan. We know that change does happen, but let's be very, very careful. We understand the next step before we take it. Your lawfully given water rights are protected by one thing and one thing only, and that's priority. There is no preferential use recognized in our water law. If we request that be changed, there is no turning back to that. Over 2/3 of our state's population depend upon Kansas reservoirs for their public water supply. These sleeping giants, as I refer to them as, are filling with sediment even as we speak. Sediment and oftentimes nutrients that cause things like harmful algal blooms. They are truly the backbone of Kansas communities, rural and urban. And so they are going to have attention moving forward, or we will not only be talking about running out of water in the Ogallala and hopefully changing that conversation, we will be talking about our reservoirs being unable to provide drinking water for industrial water, municipal water for 2/3 of our state's population. Really let that soak in. If the Ogallala is in trouble and our reservoirs in trouble, what's that say for the future of Kansas? These are difficult things we must wrestle with. So I will stop there. Thank you again for being here today. Enjoy and work hard on these conversations. Try to keep the statewide perspective in view. I know that's challenging because it's a very personal issue, but it's also something that we must have solid policy moving forward. Thank you.